The manuscript was buried under decades of dust, forgotten in a corner of the museum archive where few ever ventured. Rows of boxes sat like silent tombs, their contents abandoned by time and memory. Most archivists passed by them without a glance, but not Elias Calderón. Known as the quiet one among his colleagues, Elias had an unusual gift. He noticed what others dismissed. His eyes lingered on details no one else thought mattered. On that late afternoon, when the hum of the city dimmed outside the library walls, his hands brushed against a bundle of brittle leather bound with twine. He expected nothing more than a forgotten ledger or an inventory list. Instead, when he lifted the fragile cover, an uneasy thrill crawled through his chest. The glyphs staring back at him were unmistakable. Mayan. Elias froze, his mind racing. The codex was small, no larger than a man's hand, its pages fragile yet hauntingly preserved. The paint reds, blacks, and earthy blues glared with a vividness that seemed alive, as if the ink had resisted time itself. And carved into those colors, beneath the intricate depictions of kings and rituals, were jagged symbols unlike anything he had seen in standard Mayan texts. A voice whispered in his thoughts, "This should not exist." Most Mayan codices had been burned centuries ago, condemned as heretical by Spanish conquerors. Only a handful survived, guarded in European libraries like relics of another world. For one to appear here, hidden in his provincial museum's forgotten archive, was unthinkable. Yet here it was trembling in his hands. For a long moment, Elias only stared, his chest tightening with a mix of awe and fear. He imagined the scribe who painted these lines, the priest who had once bent over these pages by the light of a torch. The archivist's lips moved without sound, tracing the shapes. The door creaked. "Still here?" a colleague called lazily. "You'll turn into dust like those scrolls if you don't go home." Elias managed a faint smile, tucking the codex protectively against his chest. "Just one more box," he replied softly, as he always did. He preferred silence to explaining the rush in his veins. When the door closed again, Elias placed the codex on the desk under a single lamp. He could not tear his eyes away. The glyph spoke of a king, a ritual, and something else, something dark, hidden beneath the surface. Symbols twisted into patterns that almost seemed to resist interpretation, as if warning intruders away. His fingers trembled. He pulled out his notebook, sketching the lines with painstaking care. The more he copied, the more a pattern emerged. Repeated references to time, to cycles, to endings. One page depicted a serpent coiled around a burning sun. Another showed faceless figures collapsing under waves of fire and water. Elias whispered aloud without realizing it, "This isn't history. It's a warning." His heart pounded. The codex felt alive, pulsing beneath the lamp's glow. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a rational voice tried to intervene. "You're reading too much into it. You're tired. You're letting your imagination lead you astray." But a deeper instinct silenced doubt. There was something here, something real. As he leaned closer, his eyes caught faint etchings beneath the paint, subtle grooves in the parchment. It was as if the scribe had carved one message over another, hiding the truth beneath ritual imagery. The realization sent a chill racing down his spine. This wasn't merely a forgotten codex. This was a secret deliberately buried in ink and symbol. Elias pressed a hand to his temple. The museum would never believe him. The academic world would laugh as they always had. He remembered the smirks when he once suggested a misfiled scroll had belonged to an Aztec noble, only to be proven right years later. They had apologized then, but the sting of ridicule never faded. Now, staring at the codex, he felt the old wound burn. If he was wrong this time, it would be his ruin. But if he was right, he closed the book gently, as though it were alive and fragile. The lamp's light flickered, shadows stretching across the room like reaching hands. His pulse steadied, his decision already made. He would return tomorrow. He would decipher the hidden layer, and whatever this codex had to say, the world would hear it. If you're enjoying this story of justice and hidden strength, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to find out how a simple act of prejudice turned into the most valuable lesson of Elias Calderón's life. The archivist rose from his desk, clutching the codex as though it were a fragile heart beating in his hands. Outside, the night pressed close against the library windows, and in the silence, Elias could almost hear the codex whispering back. Morning sunlight filtered weakly through the museum's tall windows, casting slanted beams across the reading hall, where Elias sat alone. The codex rested on a velvet cloth, fragile yet defiant against the centuries. He had arrived earlier than anyone else, consumed by a need to continue deciphering its pages. Sleep had been a stranger. The codex's images haunted him in feverish dreams of fire and flood. Elias adjusted his glasses and bent closer. His notebook already brimmed with sketches and notes from the previous night, yet something eluded him. The symbols seemed to twist and shift, as though hiding their meaning in plain sight. The serpent encircling the sun reappeared throughout the text, always near depictions of faceless masses, human forms, stripped of identity. Death was there, yes, but cloaked in metaphors too strange for easy translation. A voice intruded. "Still chasing ghosts, Calderón?" Elias looked up to see Dr. Marcus Reinhardt, a visiting scholar from Berlin. Reinhardt carried himself with the air of a man accustomed to being heard, his sharp suit and sharper tongue a reminder of countless lectures delivered to rapt audiences. He smirked as his eyes drifted to the codex. "What is this? A children's picture book?" Reinhardt asked with theatrical disdain. "It's Mayan," Elias replied, his tone quiet but firm. "A codex, uncatalogued." Reinhardt chuckled, shaking his head. "Impossible. Only 4 Mayan codices survived the conquest. The rest were ash." "You must be mistaken." Elias swallowed, his pulse quickening. "I'm not mistaken. Look at the glyphs, the pigments, the age of the paper." But Reinhardt waved him off with a dismissive flick of the hand. "Forgeries are everywhere these days. Some local artisan trying to pass off a clever imitation. Don't let yourself be fooled, Calderón. You'll make a spectacle of yourself." The words landed like stones. Elias lowered his eyes, but inside, indignation burned. How many times had his instincts been doubted, only to prove right in the end? And yet, each time, the laughter returned louder, the ridicule sharper. Reinhardt leaned closer, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. "Take my advice. Drop it. Don't waste your reputation on a fairy tale." Then, with a self-satisfied smile, he strode away, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. Silence returned, but it was heavier now. Elias stared at the codex, the weight of doubt pressing against his chest. What if Reinhardt is right? What if I'm just imagining patterns where none exist? But then his eyes drifted back to the serpent, coiled and defiant on the page. The ink shimmered faintly under the light, as though daring him to look closer. He pulled his magnifying glass from his satchel and hovered it over the glyphs. Beneath the painted coils, faint scratches appeared almost invisible to the naked eye. Elias's breath caught. He angled the glass, letting the sunlight strike differently. Yes, there it was. A second layer, etched into the parchment itself. He traced it with a trembling finger. Unfamiliar glyphs that twisted into phrases he could barely comprehend. The hairs on his neck rose. This wasn't a forgery. No forger would go to such lengths, hiding words under paint, waiting for the careful eye of someone like him. The words whispered at the edge of understanding. Kalumte, ruler of rulers. Chaj, sacrifice. And then, a phrase that chilled him, Kuhul Katal, divine disaster. Elias leaned back, his pulse thundering. This wasn't ordinary ritual text. This was prophecy. But if he revealed it now, no one would believe him. Reinhardt's mocking smile would become the laughter of the entire academic world. He imagined the headlines. Local archivist duped by forged codex. His career, his life's work, reduced to ridicule. And yet, another vision pressed into his mind, the Mayan scribe. carving these words with desperate precision, determined to preserve a truth that others had tried to erase. The faceless figures on the page no longer felt symbolic. They felt real. People who had once lived, once suffered, and whose story had been deliberately silenced. Elias pressed a hand to his chest. He whispered, as if to the codex itself, "I believe you." The resolve settled deep within him. He would continue, in secret if he must. He would peel back every layer of this mystery until the truth stood undeniable. And if the world refused to listen, then the failure would be theirs, not his. The codex lay open like a wound upon the desk, its colors glaring under the lamplight. Elias had returned after hours, when the museum's echoing corridors emptied and silence fell heavy as stone. Only then did he feel safe enough to study without the eyes of skeptics peering over his shoulder. His fingers hovered over the etched lines he had uncovered. Hours of cross-referencing had already consumed him. Scribbled notes, grammar comparisons, fragments of Mayan myths he had memorized over years of solitary study. Tonight, something aligned. The serpent coiled around the burning sun was no longer an abstract symbol. Piece by piece, the message beneath it emerged, like a voice reaching across centuries. Elias whispered the glyphs aloud, tasting the words as though their sound could unlock their meaning. Ajaw kuhul, utsak katun, cha aj kuhul katal. Translated roughly, the Holy Lord, the Count of Ages, the sacrifice of divine disaster. A shiver ran through him. The Mayans were masters of cycles, their calendars mapped, not just time, but cosmic rhythm. To speak of a katun, a 20-year period, alongside disaster implied something precise, deliberate. Not myth, but record. He turned the page, heart hammering. More hidden glyphs emerged under careful light, scratched beneath layers of ritual painting. They told of the Aja, the king, who gathered his priests to witness omens in the sky, a blood-red moon, the trembling of earth, the roaring of waters. The glyphs described not metaphor, but catastrophe, fire, flood, collapse. And yet, Elias frowned. No such event appeared in the known Mayan chronicles. No archaeologist had recorded a city swallowed whole by sea and fire during the classic period. The disaster described here did not exist in history, or rather, it had been erased. Elias leaned back, rubbing his temples. Why would the scribes conceal such an event? To protect the authority of the king? To bury a shameful failure? Or was it because the disaster was cyclical, destined to return? The thought struck like lightning. He closed his eyes, and in the darkness, images surged. A Mayan priest, bending over the codex, painting desperately while the earth shook beneath him. A sky blackened with ash. Terrified faces staring upward as the heavens collapsed. Elias's breath came quick and shallow. He forced his eyes open, gripping the desk. Number. These aren't just words. This is memory. For a moment, doubt gnawed at him again. Perhaps exhaustion warped his mind. Perhaps Reinhardt was right, and this was all fantasy born of obsession. But the codex pulsed with a presence he could not dismiss. It demanded to be heard. He turned to his notebook, translating feverishly. The hidden text culminated in a single ominous declaration. And when the Count of Ages returns, so too shall the Kuhul Katal, the divine disaster. Those who forget shall be consumed again. Elias's hand froze. The prophecy was not merely a record of the past, it was a warning. A voice inside him whispered, "If it happened once, it can happen again." He stood abruptly, pacing the darkened room. His mind reeled with questions. Could the disaster have been a volcanic eruption, hidden from history by rulers ashamed of their failure to appease the gods? Or perhaps a cataclysmic drought, so devastating it erased entire cities? He remembered studies of collapsed Mayan centers, theories of ecological collapse and war, but this codex suggested something far more sudden, far more apocalyptic. The archivist pressed his palms against the cool glass of the window, staring out at the city's distant lights. The modern world hummed, oblivious to the shadows of forgotten ages. Yet if the Codex spoke truth, those shadows were not gone. They lingered, waiting. He returned to the desk, his resolve sharpening. If this prophecy was real, he could not keep it to himself. But if he revealed it now, they would laugh, ridicule, destroy him. He needed proof, undeniable proof, that would silence even Reinhardt's sneer. Elias traced the serpent one final time, whispering to the nameless scribe who had buried the message beneath paint, "I will finish what you began." The Codex seemed to glow faintly under his touch, as if in answer. Elias's mind drifted, pulled unwillingly into the centuries that had separated him from the scribe. He imagined the temple rising from the dense Yucatan jungle, its stones slick with morning mist, jaguar motifs carved into every corner. The air was thick with incense, and the low chant of priests echoed off the limestone walls. In the inner sanctum, a group of acolytes knelt before the king the Ajah, who held the very codex Elias now possessed. The high priest, robed in deep crimson and turquoise, bent over the pages, his fingers tracing the glyphs with reverence and fear. "It comes," he murmured, voice trembling. "The Kuhul Katal approaches. The earth will shake, and fire will fall from the sky. The river will rise against the cities, and the people will despair." The king's face remained impassive, though his hands clenched the ceremonial staff tightly. Pride had long guided his rule, but this prophecy challenged everything. Failure to avert the disaster would not only destroy his people, but stain his lineage for eternity. And yet, the priests whispered among themselves. The gods had made their intentions clear, and nothing could alter the cycle. Elias envisioned the frantic secrecy that followed. Pages were redacted, rewritten, repainted with vibrant scenes of ritual and conquest. The priests feared the truth. To record the catastrophe would bring shame, invite panic, and perhaps even rebellion. So, they hid it, burying the memory beneath layers of metaphor and sacred art, leaving only whispers for those clever enough to uncover them centuries later. A shiver ran down Elias's spine. The hidden layers he had discovered were not merely obscure, they were deliberate, carved into the parchment with meticulous care. Each symbol a barrier against oblivion, each scratch a voice demanding to be remembered. The priests' faces swam in his mind, anxious, resolute, haunted by the knowledge of what was to come. One young acolyte, wide-eyed and trembling, whispered a prayer to the gods, begging them for mercy. Another, older and scarred by years of ritual, traced the serpent motif again and again, murmuring the same phrase under his breath, "Those who forget shall be consumed again." Elias felt a strange kinship with them, though separated by centuries. Their fear mirrored his own. The pressure of knowledge, the weight of responsibility, and the creeping dread that came from seeing a catastrophe ignored all of it pressed down on him now. He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes, and saw the cities that might have vanished. Palaces and marketplaces reduced to ash, families swept away in floods, histories erased not by conquest, but by deliberate concealment. The Codex was a bridge across time, linking his world to theirs, whispering the same warning that had once compelled a civilization to hide its shame. Opening his eyes, Elias traced the hidden text again, his hands trembling. If he could only decipher the remaining glyphs, he might understand the full scope of the disaster, and perhaps even the warning for the present. But the more he uncovered, the heavier the weight became. Knowledge came with a price. Isolation, ridicule, perhaps danger. He could feel it pressing against him, the way the priests must have felt when they chose secrecy over truth. And yet, he could not stop. He had to see the prophecy fully revealed. If the world ignored it once, he would ensure it did not happen again. Somewhere deep inside, a quiet voice urged him forward. They tried to bury it. They failed. You will not. Elias's fingers grazed the codex's edges. In the shadows of the lamp, the intricate glyphs seemed to shimmer, alive with intent. The priest's warnings echoed through the centuries. A lesson in humility. A reminder of human fragility. and the cost of ignoring what was known but inconvenient. He leaned closer, whispering a vow to the past and future alike. I will not let history repeat its silence. Days bled into nights, with a rhythm that Elias could no longer measure. The museum's corridors, once bustling with casual visitors and distant footfalls, had become a chamber of solitude. He spent hours hunched over the codex, tracing glyph after glyph, whispering their meaning to himself, as though repetition could coax the past into clarity. Yet each revelation only deepened his sense of isolation. Outside, the city went on, unknowing. Cars hummed along avenues, streetlights blinked in rhythmic obedience, and people laughed without concern for the shadows of forgotten centuries. Elias felt the distance of time pressing in the codex's message, pulsing like a heartbeat that belonged to another age. The warning of divine disaster lingered in his mind, relentless and urgent, refusing to be silenced. His colleagues had already begun noticing his absence. Emails went unanswered. Polite inquiries about his well-being were brushed aside. Reinhardt's earlier ridicule echoed in his ears, a constant reminder that the world outside the archive would not care for prophecies etched in ancient ink. Even the thought of consulting other Mayan scholars seemed dangerous. Disclosure could invite dismissal, or worse, theft, exploitation, disbelief so absolute it could destroy his credibility. And yet, the Codex refused to allow him to retreat. Symbols shifted beneath the light, revealing layers that had previously remained hidden. Faces of the long-forgotten people stared from the pages faceless, yet imploring. A trembling child, arms raised to the sky, glyphs of fire and water swirling around, priests performing rituals under collapsing stone ceilings, a king, alone and resolute, clutching a ceremonial dagger, knowing history would forget him. Elias felt a pressure in his chest, the weight of centuries pressing down on fragile human shoulders. He realized the Codex was no ordinary text. It was memory, witness, and warning combined. It demanded recognition, comprehension, and perhaps most terrifyingly, action. A cold doubt crept in, whispering through his thoughts like a shadow. What if you're wrong? What if this is just fantasy? He shook his head, resisting. He had studied Mayan history for years, learned to recognize the subtle truths hidden behind ritualistic metaphor. The patterns were undeniable. The cycles, the recurring catastrophes, the coiled serpent motif, they all pointed to a reality erased from history. Yet every time he raised his eyes from the pages, the isolation struck him like a physical force. The archivist, who had been quietly respected in his field, now felt alone, adrift, a messenger of secrets that no one seemed willing to receive. Even the Codex, his sole companion, whispered warnings too heavy for him to carry alone. Sleep became impossible. In the dark hours, the symbols appeared in his dreams, alive and shifting. Rivers of molten rock, skies split by lightning, cities drowned beneath waves, and crowds fleeing faceless terror. Each vision left his chest tight, his throat dry, yet pulled him inexorably toward the truth buried within the ancient text. Elias rubbed his eyes and whispered aloud to himself, I have to understand it. I have to know what they tried to hide, even if no one believes me. A sound echoed in the room, the faint scrape of paper, as if the Codex itself responded. Elias froze. He leaned closer and, for a brief, terrifying instant, the glyphs seemed to shimmer under the lamp's glow. They pulsed as though alive, demanding recognition, demanding vigilance. He realized, with a cold clarity, that he could not abandon this pursuit. To ignore the Codex was to fail the centuries that had entrusted him with their secret. To doubt the prophecy was to betray the very memory of those who had perished in disasters they had tried desperately to record and conceal. And so, Elias resolved to continue, though the path would be lonely, and the world beyond these walls deaf to the warnings written in ancient ink. He would endure ridicule, doubt, and isolation, for the Codex had chosen him, and he would not turn away. The moment arrived quietly, without fanfare or heralding sound. Elias had spent countless nights, hunched over the codex, eyes raw, mind teetering on exhaustion, yet something deep within him whispered that tonight, the final truth would reveal itself. The hidden etchings beneath layers of paint, previously indecipherable, began to form coherent phrases under his careful scrutiny. He leaned closer, magnifying glass trembling in his hand. Each symbol now emerged with a clarity that seemed almost supernatural, as though the codex had been waiting for him alone to unlock its secret. He traced the final sequence of glyphs, murmuring the translation aloud. When the count of ages completes, fire shall consume the lowlands, water shall reclaim the plains, and men shall falter before the wrath of the divine cycle. Those who ignore this shall be undone. The words struck him like a physical blow. The disaster described was both precise and terrifying: fire, flood, and societal collapse, all concealed in metaphors deliberately erased from historical records. He could see, in his mind's eye, entire cities swallowed by flames, waves overtaking markets and temples, the faces of the frightened, the helpless, the doomed. Elias's chest tightened. He realized this prophecy was not merely a chronicle of the past, it was a warning intended for those who would live in the future. The Mayan scribes had hidden it carefully, aware of human frailty, aware that to reveal the truth too soon could bring despair or rebellion. Yet they had encoded it in a way that a careful, patient reader could discover a solitary archivist, perhaps chosen by fate, across the centuries. He paused, letting the magnitude of the revelation sink in. The Codex was not just history. It was a bridge between ages, a voice of those long gone demanding that their knowledge not be lost again, and the weight of that responsibility pressed down on him. Elias traced the serpent motif once more, feeling the hidden scratches beneath the paint. Each stroke was a warning, each layer a plea. The scribes had encoded their understanding of natural cycles, celestial movements, and human vulnerability into these pages. The catastrophe, he realized, had a pattern. It was not random, and if history could offer a lesson, then recognition of that pattern might be the key to survival. But alongside the awe came fear. What if the prophecy still held relevance for the present? What if the cycles had not ended? Could humanity face a repetition of what had been hidden, unrecorded, erased? The thought made his stomach churn. The implications were staggering. Entire populations at risk, societies unprepared, civilizations blind to the lessons of their ancestors. He forced himself to breathe, to focus on what he could control. There was no immediate panic, no loud alarm. The responsibility was quiet, personal, a burden to be carried alone until he could determine the next step. Yet, the Codex's glow seemed almost imperceptibly to intensify, as though affirming his role as its interpreter. Elias leaned back, mind racing through possible interpretations. Could he provide evidence, proof of the disaster's pattern, without inviting ridicule? Could he convince the world that history had not only hidden this truth, but that it might recur? The challenge was immense, but hesitation was not an option. He was not merely an archivist now. He was the steward of centuries of hidden knowledge, a guardian of the prophecy itself. The room seemed to close around him, walls pressing, shadows elongating in the lamplight. And in the silence, he whispered a vow to the scribe who had etched these warnings so long ago. I will see this through. I will ensure the warning is heard. Elias carefully closed the codex, placing it in a protective box. He understood, now more than ever, that his journey had only begun. The prophecy had been revealed, and with it came the imperative to act, to decipher its full implications, and perhaps to warn the world before it was too late. The city outside carried on in blissful ignorance, oblivious to the tremors of history that Elias had unearthed. He moved through the museum's deserted halls like a man possessed, the codex under his arm, his mind a storm of calculations, translations, and dread. Every detail he had uncovered pointed to an undeniable conclusion. The prophecy was not just a record of the past. Its patterns, cycles, and celestial markers suggested recurrence. Elias knew he could not remain silent. Yet each thought of disclosure came with a rising tide of fear. He imagined Reinhardt's mocking sneer, the public humiliation, the headlines dismissing him as a deluded archivist, chasing shadows. Worse, what if the world refused to believe him until it was too late? Could he shoulder the responsibility of warning millions? Knowing the inevitable ridicule and opposition that would follow, he returned to the Codex late into the night, scrutinizing its final pages with meticulous care. The etched layers beneath the ceremonial illustrations were more precise than ever, revealing timelines and celestial markers aligned with the cycles of the Mayan calendar. His pulse quickened. The disaster, he realized, was predictable. The evidence was indisputable if he could only convey it convincingly. But skepticism ran deep in the corridors of academia, deeper than the jungles where the Codex had originated. Even the most brilliant warnings were often dismissed when they threatened pride, belief, or comfort. Elias thought of the priests who had hidden this knowledge, of the king who had allowed secrecy to dominate truth. History had punished those who exposed inconvenient facts. Would the world do any differently now? He closed his eyes. Memories of the visions pressing upon him, faceless figures fleeing fire and flood, the collapse of temples and marketplaces, the anguish etched into human forms centuries ago. Their silent plea weighed on him, demanding action, demanding recognition. He could not let history repeat itself. He had been entrusted with a warning that must reach ears willing to hear. The choice was agonizing. To act meant risk. Risk of professional annihilation, personal disgrace, and perhaps threats he could not anticipate. To remain silent, to doubt himself, was unthinkable. The prophecy was more than mere ink and parchment. It was a moral imperative. The scribes had trusted a future reader, and he had been chosen. Hours passed. The city slept beneath artificial lights, while Elias compiled his findings, cross-referencing the Codex with known archaeological records and celestial events. Each confirmation brought a rush of hope, tempered by dread. The disaster's recurrence was measurable, predictable, terrifying, yet solvable if understood and prepared for. Finally, he made his decision. Tomorrow, he would approach a select few scholars cautious, discreet, but unwavering. The prophecy had to be validated by minds capable of discerning truth without prejudice. Evidence had to speak louder than skepticism, calculation stronger than ridicule. Only then could the warning escape the shadows of history and reach those who might prevent repetition. Elias leaned back, breathing deeply. The Codex lay open, its glyphs shimmering faintly in the lamplight. He felt the weight of centuries pressing upon him, the long-forgotten priests, the king who had hidden the truth, and the countless victims whose memory had been erased. A quiet resolve settled over him. He would face the scorn, the disbelief, the isolation. He would bear the burden of knowledge alone if necessary. The prophecy demanded it. And somewhere, in the faint rustle of the Codex's pages, Elias thought he heard a whisper of approval, a voice across centuries murmuring, "Do not falter. The future depends on it." Months had passed since Elias Calderón first unlocked the hidden prophecy. The museum buzzed with activity once more, but he no longer sought validation from colleagues or accolades from the academic world. The Codex had been studied, debated, and cautiously verified by a select group of scholars who had learned to see beyond pride and skepticism. The disaster it described, a convergence of fire, flood, and ecological collapse, had been mitigated, thanks to the careful planning inspired by his warning. Lives had been saved, cities reinforced, and communities prepared, though the broader public remained largely unaware of how close they had come to catastrophe. Elias walked through the museum halls, his steps quieter than the tourists and students bustling around him. The Codex rested securely in a climate-controlled display case, its secrets now partially revealed, its warnings heeded. He paused before it, tracing the outline of the serpent motif pressed into the parchment. He thought of the Mayan priests who had hidden their knowledge, the king who had feared its power, and the scribes whose meticulous hands had carved warnings beneath layers of ceremonial painting. Their foresight had transcended centuries, entrusting him with a responsibility he had once feared he could not bear. The world outside continued unaware, yet in a quiet corner of his mind, Elias recognized a profound truth. History's lessons are often ignored until repetition forces recognition. Pride, disbelief, and human arrogance can obscure even the clearest warnings. But humility, careful attention, and the courage to pursue truth despite ridicule can change outcomes, can save lives, and can honor those silenced by time. Elias smiled faintly, a mixture of relief and lingering awe. He remembered the ridicule he had faced, the sleepless nights consumed by fear and doubt, and the isolation that had pressed down like a physical weight. Yet each trial had strengthened his resolve, deepened his understanding of both human nature and the fragile persistence of knowledge. In facing doubt, he had learned that the courage to act is often greater than the certainty of success. Outside, the city glimmered under the afternoon sun, oblivious to the shadow of catastrophe that had nearly fallen. The Codex, now secure, seemed almost alive in its silent wisdom. Elias knew that its lessons would endure, not because of recognition or fame, but because someone had listened, had acted, and had honored the voices of the past. As he stepped away, he whispered a final thought into the quiet museum air, a tribute to the generations who had trusted him. You were never forgotten. Your warning endured, and it has made all the difference. Elias turned toward the exit, the weight of responsibility replaced by a quiet, abiding satisfaction. He had walked the thin line between disbelief and truth, isolation and action, and had emerged not only a witness to history, but a guardian of its lessons. The Codex's prophecy had been fulfilled not through devastation, but through vigilance, humility, and the courage to heed voices long silenced. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel to discover more stories about how extraordinary people turn humiliation into triumph.